I think we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Ellie Rader. I host the Professional Humans podcast. It's a podcast about the intersection of life and work. I've had the honor of having Linda on our podcast, and it was amazing. We've had the podcast since about 2015. So thanks for letting me moderate this amazing panel, and compliments to Linda for assembling a really great group of panelists here. So a couple of caveats. I think podcasters are typically used to not being live and having the ability to edit, and I'll speak for myself, maybe not for them, but also a lot of times in our pajamas. So we all had to get dressed and be ready to be live today with no safety net of editing or being able to mess up. So bear with us, especially me. If we could take just one other, no, I'll wait for that question until after everybody introduces themselves. So if we could just take a quick minute and introduce yourself and say what your podcast is, and then pass it on.
Hello, my name is Jeffrey Luciak. My podcast is called From Here with Jeffrey Luciak. It is about, I talk with artists and entrepreneurs about the creative hustle, really talking about the ups and downs of the mental game behind making the leap and running your own business.
Hello, my name is Molly Martin, and my podcast is a little different. It's an audio lesson in Spanish. It's called the Medical Spanish Podcast. And I'm a doctor, and so I started it when I got enthusiastic about mastering my Spanish again in 2007. I've been doing it ever since.
Hi everyone, my name is CJ Fortier. I am the host of Blunt Cuts podcast, and Blunt Cuts is a podcast for women, everything from curiosity to empowerment. We have a really short format, and our promise and my promise when I go into the studio is to be my most authentic self, and we ask that of our guests to come in, park their passive at the door, and be their most authentic selves in sharing their real life with our listeners.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellie Krug. I am here because I have a hybrid. So I have actually a live radio show every week on AM 950 that goes into podcasts. The name of the show is Ellie 2.0 Radio. It is about idealism and idealists, people who are trying to make the world a better place. I'm a hopeless idealist.
Yes.
I have a big mouth, so I probably don't need this. So my name's Kevin D. Wright, and I lead what's called the Leadership is Personal podcast. And the podcast is really about leadership. I have a number of different guests on that are leaders across the country. And if I had to sum up what my podcast was, it's leadership without the BS. And so I really do call BS if I have guests on that attempt to be too political or attempt to be too PC, if you will. I've had people that I've interviewed that I didn't run their podcast because that's not what we do on my podcast. And so my podcast is really for those people that want to understand how to lead people without all the BS that's associated with it. And it's called the Leadership is Personal podcast because at my core, I truly believe that relationship is everything. Not relationships are everything, but relationship is everything, one-to-one, and leadership is personal.
Hi, I'm Ken Kunze. I do a podcast, or I'm co-host of a podcast called Architect Sessions. Mostly we talk to architects and other design professionals about architecture, politics, professional, and design.
Okay. So before I dive into the questions, podcasters, show of hands, how, wait, hold on, I do that. The camera operator. Oh, did you just give your job away?
Yeah, because I think if we just go a little closer
Great.
to who's speaking, it might be better for people that are not here.
So you're going to drive the chair?
I don't know.
Okay. Show of hands. how many of you is podcasting a significant portion of your monthly income?
Can you ask the question again?
Anti-raising my hand.
Indirectly.
Say the question again, Ellie.
Indirectly.
Indirectly, that's a great point, we're gonna come back to that.
What's the question again?
The question is, for how many of you is podcasting a significant portion of your monthly income? Directly. Like yeah?
Yeah, I mean, because I sell premium podcasts. So my podcast is a little different because I use it to distribute audio lessons. So it is not like the main portion of my income. My main job is being a doctor, so that's my main income. But if I were to stop that and go into just podcasting, that would be direct income because I sell premium audio lessons to people. Got it. Okay, cool.
All right, so a little bit of a different model, and all of these panelists have a little bit of a different format. I asked the question about income because I actually put way more money into my podcast than ever comes back out of it. And I just don't want you to think that this is a get-rich-quick thing. This is 1,000% a labor of love. These talented people are very passionate about what they do. It's not I don't think any of us are in a podcast where we don't have something really meaningful to contribute or something to, that we feel like we want to add, but I don't think it's a get-rich-quick endeavor, very much labor of love. Okay, just level setting. So indirectly, Kevin, let's come back to that one. You said your podcast is actually indirectly contributing to your income. You want to explain that?
Sure, and I probably don't need that. So I am a speaker, executive coach, and consultant. And so oftentimes, when someone is considering hiring me, typically for their keynote or their platform or what have you, they begin doing their due diligence. And so they, of course, look at YouTube, they look at my website, and then they invariably look at the podcast. Yeah. And I have heard a number of times where they said, we heard you on the podcast, and that's what helped us to say yes to you. And so that's why I say indirectly, it does contribute.
It's a great marketing tool.
Part of the brand.
Yeah, part of the brand. Awesome. Okay, so we've all of these podcasters have just a little bit of a different format. Some are interview driven, some are sharing knowledge, some are interactive, different ways of distribution, different places that the podcasts are posted. So once we get into the breakout sessions, lots of interesting things to dive into with people. But if we could just go down the line again and help us understand your inspiration for starting the podcast. And did you have a particular moment where you said, I gotta have a podcast, and you just started?
Yes, I think I fought it for a while because it was so scary to me. I come from a background of theater and performing arts and visual arts. So the idea of going fully audio to tell a story, to create something, was a big leap for me. And I think I pushed against it for a while. A lot of my friends were talking. It's that idea of how can I get my brand out there? I'm a coach and facilitator as well. And I was like, how can people get to know who I am? How do I do an extension of the brand? And there was something that was really petrifying to me about just doing audio with no visual. And of course, anytime that happens, that's the right thing to do. If you're petrified, let's jump in and do it. So for me, that's why I kind of did the leap. And within that, my major why of why this kind of podcast was because as a new entrepreneur, I'm 2 years in, I was going through these things and feeling alone and saying, what am I doing? It's Monday and no one's emailing back, and what happens now? And really wanted to reach out and be around people. Also, I've had the amazing privilege to be in a lot of different worlds over my life, my 20 years here in Minneapolis, and not only been in the nonprofit sector, the entrepreneur sector, but also the art sector. And I saw a real connection between all of those fields and going, oh, if I'm feeling alone, I'm not just siloed in my coach world. There's something that I can learn from somebody who is also a restaurateur. I can learn something from somebody who is an artist going out and trying to sell a painting or performance. So what I wanted to do is connect that thread and say, how can we all feel less lonely and connect together and have real conversations about what is it actually like day to day to get through and to have a successful business.
My podcasting journey started by mistake. It was basically, I was up in Bemidji, Minnesota, and went to Honduras and came back and was like in love with Spanish and Latin America again, and thought I need to pursue this. And so I was part of a lot of online groups, learning, speaking Spanish together, and I started a podcast just for us to learn advanced Spanish grammar, to practice it. And I put it out on iTunes just because it was 2007, like it didn't mean much to put it out there. I didn't think anyone would be listening to it. And there was a huge response, and so I thought, okay, I'll do a medical Spanish because I have something to offer that's unique to me. So I started creating it. It was all free, and I meant to keep it always free. I brought up the income part of it because I want people to realize that that's something I think I have to offer. I have made podcasting into a little business, and I can offer how I did that in a small group if you like. But that definitely is not the motivation, and if it is, you're not going to last. It is, I probably make 5 cents an hour or something like that on my business plan. And that's how I got started, just for a love of Spanish in Latin America. Learning Spanish in Latin America is what drives me.
So similarly to Jeffrey, my background is in visual branding, design, advertising, marketing, and kind of fashion spaces. So when this podcast thought popped into my mind, I actually was kind of refreshed with the challenge of I can't be visual here, and I don't want it to be a video podcast. I want it to be straight audio and have some anonymity behind the microphone, just so that I knew going in, the passion moment for me and that pivot point was continuous conversation about the fact that I'm a direct woman. And this happened to me in business scenarios, this happened to me in friendship. Like, how can you be so honest and direct and say what you actually mean? And to me, that was just who I was. But I realized that people, and women specifically, felt they needed permission to be direct. And I wanted to have a place in which I could have a platform for women to come in, strong women to share their stories so that other women knew it was okay to be who you are and be direct and have a voice at the table, and stand up and speak out. So that's really where the passion drove it forward.
Hi, Ellie Krug. I'm a student of Dr. King and Robert F. Kennedy. They were alive when I was alive. And before they were murdered, they talked to me, and I understood about the need to make a positive difference in our world through real change. And I went to law school to change the world. I got caught up in some issues that prevented me from doing that. But when I transitioned genders 10 years ago, I stopped being a trial lawyer and decided that I was going to go out and try and make the world a better place, like real-time better place. I got on a radio show 3 years ago, and afterwards the station manager came to me and said, "Would you like your own radio show?" And I said, "Sure." And so since then I've been building a brand around the idea that all humans are attempting to survive the human condition, and that all humans have the capacity for positive change. And so I have a show where I bring on people who are making differences in the world. I highlight past idealists. Sometimes people will pay their lives for their idealism. And surprisingly, I did not expect that the radio show would become so popular as a podcast. But among other things, I train on human inclusivity across the country. And everywhere I go, people come up to me and say, "I love that podcast last week that you did." And I'm like, "I have no idea that you even knew I did a podcast, that I went to podcasts." So anyway, so that's what I'm doing. I'm, as I said, a hopeless idealist.
So I want to make certain that I'm answering the right question. It's the passion behind it, right?
It was what sparked your need?
So I'm a recovering corporate guy. I spent 20 years in financial services. I came to the Twin Cities from Philadelphia, my Northeast friend over here, from Philadelphia to lead Six Sigma for Target Financial Services. Realized it really wasn't a financial services organization. He went back to financial services at U.S. Bank for a number of years as a leader there. And quite honestly, there's so much BS in business, right? You know, this whole notion of not being direct, man, I will tell you, when I moved here, it was quite interesting. I'll say that.
It's its own language, right?
It really is. And, you know, being a leader, coming from the Northeast, you know, there's a certain modus operandi or rules of engagement that sort of differ from the Twin Cities. And so, yeah, it's just much more direct. You know? So my passion really came out of, and I've always led that way. And I've had, you know, wonderful success by the grace of God in business. And sometimes people just couldn't understand, like, why the hell is everybody like working for you? You know? And I tended to look a little different than everyone else in my room, right? That were my colleagues. And so, you know, really what I tried to help them to understand that it ain't about you, it's about them. And so I've always led from the place of, you know, how can I help you, right? I often tell leaders that those people that work for you, they don't work for you. You work for them, right? I mean, the whole notion is that you're trying to scale yourself through the people whose efforts that you lead. And so I really got kind of tired of, you know, looking at other leaders and seeing how they led. And, you know, one day I'll write another book, and it's going to be called "Why Do You Get the Most Food in the Cafeteria?" And the reason why I'm going to do that is because oftentimes people would always say, "Why do you get more food than everybody else in the cafeteria?" And what I found out, the reason why is because to me, they weren't just serving food. You know, I wanted to have a conversation with them. I wanted to understand who they were. They had the same challenges, fears, you know, that we do.
Wait, is this a metaphor, or are you really?
No, I'm dead serious. It's not a metaphor. It is, you know, when you go into the cafeteria and you're in these corporate structures, you know, I'm going down with other senior leaders, and it's kind of, let me have that, let me have that, let me have that. You know, and I'm like, hey, Luis, what's happening, man? What'd you do this weekend? You know? Yeah. And so, you know, I just think that leadership is really personal. And to the extent that you get to know and understand the other people, I mean, as a leader, you should be able to tell who your subordinates' partners are, who their children are, and what they care about, what communities that they're part of. And so I've always led from a place of leadership is personal, and that's sort of been the impetus of why I created it. Now, that's the reason why, but I'll tell you that it was really my marketing guy who said, "You are going to do this." You know? And I'm like, "No, I don't really want to do this." And he's like, "Look, I tell you what, why don't we just do one show and see how it works?" So we did one show.
And now you're still doing it.
Yeah. And so it was like, maybe we'll do one more show. And this minimally viable product became a podcast.
Yeah.
And it's morphed over time a little bit to be more of less of a me on the microphone and a platform to interview other leaders, you know, but that's really my passion came out of my love for people.
Cool.
That's all it is.
All right. Ken?
Like CJ said, I'm from a profession that is inherently visual. So to actually put together a podcast, it was born out of the idea that the podcasts that were out there were, I'm a low talker. So,
That's why.
yeah. And, let me just, one aside, this will come up later. You will hate how you sound on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Just trust that right now.
So sick of hearing yourself talk.
Yeah, it's really bad. But what I found out was that all the podcasts that were talking about architecture were actually talking about architecture. And that to me is inherently boring. And I find architects, if you can get them to step outside themselves, which by that I mean is that when they're stepping outside of the talking about architecture and actually talking about themselves, they're actually much more interesting and relatable as human beings. And I think most people in this room probably don't even know what an architect does, don't even know architects, don't know that architects actually have interesting ideas beyond the profession that are much more engaging. And so I wanted to try, and I brought this podcast idea to the host, who we're friends with for this website, And I said, I want to do this podcast, but I want to use your name on it. And he said, well, we were thinking about doing something very similar. Would you like to join us as a co-host? And I said, oh, that's great. So we started talking about general news items, started very small, and then we just started asking more architects to come on to try to prove to people that architects aren't assholes. And with some modest success, some have been assholes. But the last podcast we did, we had somebody who actually touched something deeper in both of us that we didn't know was there. So that was quite rewarding. So it's very nice.
Kevin, I can totally relate to your story. I went kicking and screaming into having a podcast, actually. Didn't want to do it. And it wasn't until somebody, I did it anyway because of my co-host. And so when somebody came up to me and said, I learned something really cool and I did something better at work because of it, I was like, oh, okay, I can do that. I'll keep doing this. This is cool. Yeah, so that was nice. All right, we're going to go around again. And this time, I'd love to hear, and we'll probably go, this is probably our only other question, depending on our cycle here. What has been the most challenging, let's do a two-part question, we'll go through. What has been the most challenging part of having a podcast, to give people some context about what it's like, and what has been just the most rewarding? Fair?
And can you start, Ellie, so we make sure we hear your voice?
Oh, sure. Yep. Well, the most challenging part for me has been the technical side of it. I work in technology. I love technology, but just didn't have any interest in learning the sound production, and had endless debates with my co-host about who cares about the sound quality. I was way more into the creating a space for my guests to have a really genuine conversation, and I didn't feel like putting a microphone in front of their face was going to foster that. So I was really against some of the technology that surrounds it. Gave into it because feedback was your sound sucks, and so I gave into it and figured out a way to get through it. But the most challenging part is definitely the sound production and the amount of work that goes into that. Most rewarding part, I have learned so much from the people that have come on and been guests on our show, and have had my own perspective has shifted and grown, and my confidence in facilitating a great conversation and my own confidence in speaking and sharing what I know has changed me as a professional human, and that has been very rewarding.
A little bit off of that, I think the most challenging for me is the amount of time it physically takes. I'm a one-person show. It's all me. I have my equipment in my bag, and I go to the Artists and Entrepreneurs creative space. I set up, we record there. We talk for an hour, sometimes hour 15, and then I go and do all of that. So I was excited about figuring out, because again, that challenge thing, I'm like, I want to figure out how sound works. But really that takes so much time, because not only do I have this hour-long tape, I then split that into 3 podcasts. So I'm short form as well, so most of my podcasts are only about 15 to 20 minutes at most. So I take a longer conversation and edit it around, because most hour-long conversations loop around 3 different topics I found. And so for myself, I wanted to keep it short form, so it's something you can start your day with and have a little thing at the end and then move on. But that takes more time. So the majority of my time is spent in front of the computer, editing, finding and moving, and I love that stuff though. So it's challenging only in the way of saying, how many hours do I have in the day, but it's fulfilling in the way that that's exciting to me. I'm now going from a visual art storyteller to an audio storyteller now. I'm really loving that challenge and diving into it, so I'm having a good time with that. The most rewarding part is talking to these amazing human beings that I have had the opportunity to talk to. Reaching out and each season, I have a few people I know, and then I always have some like big asks, and everyone has said yes so far, and I've loved that idea that they're willing to be vulnerable with me in those moments and have a deep conversation about what it actually is like for them. So super, super rewarding.
It's amazing the people that say yes.
Right?
Oh, they said yes.
Coming on my show. It's a lot of anxiety. Sorry.
I think that I agree. I think the biggest challenging part is the editing. Mine is an interactive audio lesson, so there's a ton of time put into that, and I have to thank Kinder for a journalist. If anyone uses that, it's great for a very edited podcast. You need to edit a lot. The most rewarding is the networking. Now, I don't do interviews, but I work with Spanish teachers, and the amount that I've learned and the relationships that I've gained from working with teachers in Latin America has been amazing, and I wouldn't have gone out and done that without this. And I just went to a school in Guatemala, and we promote the school and our podcast, and that relationship that I've developed with that school and the community there is something I don't think I would have done otherwise. And the fact that I can give back to them, because you go there and you take classes as a normal student, but when you can put their name out there and show that put their teachers out there and promote their school, that to me is the biggest reward.
So I want to take you guys through a little bit of a journey of how we started and where our format shifted to answer the question, just because I think it's really important. But my answer to your question of what has been the hardest thing is change. And I'm a perfectionist by nature, so my type A of when I set out to do this, I started with a brand, and I started with a strong brand, and Blunt Cuts was partially due to my blunt demeanor and partially due to my haircut. And my co-host at the beginning of our process also had a blunt bob, but she was a platinum blonde. So it worked very well for our branding, for all of that to be there. So that was around 2 years ago, and we started. And I feel like I kind of forced someone who wasn't a podcaster into podcasting in the hopes that she would love it and be passionate as much as I did. And it turns out that the hours and the time commitment to podcasting, external of life, full-time creative director, full-time editorial stylist, and mother of 2, 1 on the way. I'm always busy, so I didn't realize that other people don't want a passion project another 40 to 60 hours in their work. So anyway, weird, right? So we started out, we did 4 episodes, and she just absolutely hated all of it. We were learning that the technology, of course, like the microphones, the soundboards, none of us knew what we were doing. We knew we wanted quality, so we went to a studio that had the stuff. But there was no one to teach us the stuff. So we plugged and played and guessed and checked, and to me, that's a fun challenge. To others, that is absolutely mind-numbingly, sucking the life out of them. So then when we got on to record, it was painful. So she ended up saying, hey, I'm out after episode 1. And I said, can we do 5, call it a season 1? She's like, I'll give you 3. I'm like, okay. So we made 3 episodes into 5. And then my director and producer at the same time were like, she's out. We need to tell you, CJ, this is way more than we signed up for. We're out. So then it's me. And a Minneapolis-St. magazine article came out about Blunt Cuts the very same month that my entire team left me. So we were at a crossroads and had the opportunity in time for me to say, I'm continuing. I told Jonna Peliquin, okay, here's the deal, Jonna, my whole team left, so I don't know if you want to run this. And she said, no, we're running this and you're doing this. So I changed the format of having rotating women guests in, and that was the best thing that could have ever happened to the podcast, because it took our 2 perspectives and widened that to a wide sea of women and all of their perspectives in their lives and what they bring to the table. And it's something that 2 people couldn't have done. So brilliant, amazing format change because of necessity and exhaustion of my original team. But the beautiful thing is we had a format by the time the first team exited that worked. So finding that format, figuring out what worked for us, it's very simply, we started out, we introduce who someone is, we get into the blunt topic at hand. We tell a story about it, we tell a lesson learned, and we end. So it's very quick, under 30-minute podcast is our goal. So that's kind of changed. That was the hardest thing. And then the most rewarding thing, I'm still shocked and awed when people tell me they've listened to the podcast. I know I'm putting this out there, but I'm actually surprised when people say, hey, we've listened and you've made an impact in my day, or I was having a hard morning and I listened to Blunt Cuts, or we've released a Raising Strong Women episode. I have a 9-year-old daughter that is my clone, so that's going to be a challenge. But yeah, so that changing people's lives is really amazing, and I never really set out to do that with this, and it can't stop because of that.
That's really inspirational, so it's really great to hear, CJ. So most rewarding for me is that I get to meet a whole lot of people that I otherwise would not have met. And I have a regular, multifaceted feed on the internet, so I'm reading all kinds of stories about the world that I would otherwise probably not have the time to read and pay attention to. So that's really great. The challenges for me are, one, finding guests. It's extremely, this is just a side job for me, as it sounds like it is for many people. I'm a trainer on human inclusivity. I go across North America. I mean, last year I did 170 trainings. So just trying to find the time to recruit guests has been very, very difficult. The other is I want to expand the platform, so I'm going to put the shout out right now to everyone here. I'm actually trying to also create LE 2.0 TV. So if there's anybody here that can help me with that platform, YouTube platform, I'd sure appreciate that, because, and I will pay. I need the help. So, thanks.
Okay, so the toughest and the most rewarding. I think the toughest is not just podcasts for me, it's just life, meaning staying out of my own head is the hardest part. I have this Leadership is Personal podcast, and like most humans, you know, I sometimes have these self-limiting beliefs and go, I can't go there, or, you know, damn, did I push too hard, or, you know, I do it anyway because I'm hard-headed. But I think that's really the hardest part for me. Coming from the corporate sector and having a team and always having someone to sort of bounce things off of and, you know, sort of gauge against. The toughest part is, you know, staying out of my own head and not consistently trying to change all the time, because, I don't know, maybe it's my adult ADD, but I get a little bored sometimes and want to change up something. So that's probably the hardest part. The most rewarding part is, I would say that the harsh man said we should be ashamed to die until we won a victory for mankind. And so what's most rewarding to me is when I bump into someone, I get a text, I get an email or something that says this helped with ... You know, it could vary. It could be, you know, a 20-minute podcast, but it's just 30 seconds that someone heard that said that really made a difference for me. That's probably the most rewarding. That's about it for me.
Two of the most challenging things for me about the podcast has been one, we don't do scripted. We don't do scripted at all. I do some research depending on who we have on the podcast. If it's somebody who is pretty well known and is pretty well been interviewed, that makes it harder for us to have an authentic conversation, because everything we know about that individual is already out there in the environment. So I try to go a little deeper, so that forces me to do a little bit more homework. But actually the hardest and the worst thing to do have happen on the podcast is when somebody comes on and they have nothing to say. And you have to try to make them interesting. And then you have an hour conversation. We had one conversation, it was early in our podcast, we've been around for almost 5 years, and we had someone come on, he was selling hoverboard. And we were starting to get into some deep implications of the technology as it related to the defense industry. And his partner, his spouse, was off mic advising him not to say certain things, which is, pardon my Jersey, but fucking awful. It was horrible to have a conversation with somebody and they can't say something. And then we had somebody on who was an architecture student, went to architecture school, and then started a coffee business in LA. And he really had a specific understanding about what we thought was about architecture, and then talked about nothing, absolutely nothing. And large amounts of like struggling to find something interesting for people to talk about. It was awful. The best and most rewarding podcasts have been when there's actually been some self-revelatory information that the architects haven't even considered, and you ask them the right question and it unlocks a possibility that they hadn't even considered. Not about design, but about their legacy, or about how they treat their people, or about what they were, and they weren't thinking about that, but we brought it out of them. Or their connection to social justice work, or their passions about tilting at the industry or the profession. So those are the moments that we walk away and we find something about ourselves and they find something about themselves that you weren't expecting. And so those are moments that are really, really positive.
There was just a request on the Facebook, they might have missed it, to say the names of your podcasts one more time.
Oh, sure. Yep, we can do that in the next round. Ken, I think that's really important. Those drawing out those really authentic moments in an interview, those are the moments that listeners really hone in on, and they can sense the magic that's happening. It's really, really powerful. Informal poll. How many of you have woken up in the middle of the night after publishing an episode and gone, oh shit, you started swearing, so now I can swear. Oh shit, I gotta take it down, I can't say that. And gotten up in the middle of the night and taken an episode and edited it more, and then re-released it.
1 to 2 are actually dead.
Actually did.
Never did, but always want to.
Always wanted to? Yeah, all right. Check the time. We're doing great on time, right? Timekeeper? Yes. Okay, this is a lightning round. This is the last question. Get ready. And you have to say the name of your podcast again so that we can acknowledge that there's both requests. Name of your podcast and... Shit, what was my question? Oh, I know what it was. One piece of advice for the group here. Name of your podcast, one piece of advice. I'll go. Professional humans. What is one piece of advice? It's supposed to be a lightning round and I just failed it. My time's up. Just start. That's my advice. Just start. And if you've got something that you want to share, just share it and somebody will relate to it, and just get started. Don't worry about the challenges.
From here with Jeffrey Luciak. My one thing of advice is really keep your why clear and grounded and be your touchstone. It's so crazy to hit send and then it's just there and you have no idea what's been happening, and then you start getting in your head and you're like, whoa. Have your clear why. This is why I'm doing this for me. This is why I want to make a change in the world. Here's my why. Sit with that. No matter what happens, every time you hit send, you will never know what will come back. But if you're grounded in your why, then it's why you're doing it. It makes it make sense for you, and it's rewarding for you. So stick with that why and have it clear.
My name is Molly Martin. I do the Medical Spanish podcast, and from an educational podcast perspective, my advice is if there's something that you really love that you want to learn more about, then go. That's want to improve in yourself. And don't be afraid to put something out there where you're not the expert and you're getting advice, because you learning it and sharing what you're learning with everyone else will be surprisingly useful. You don't have to be the expert. You just have to have the curiosity and passion for what you're going to podcast about.
CJ Fortier, Blunt Cuts, BLUNT Cuts, podcast.com. Also find Instagram at bluntcuts_podcast, and that's where you will see nipples, vaginas, all things. That is our blunt brand, because we are visually blunt as well, and all about women. So there you go. That's a fun caveat. Enter at your risk. Right? This is what you have to do. But my one piece of advice is to fail forward. And that is one of my pieces of advice in life. But really, truly, this is not an easy journey to enter, but it is a fun and rewarding exploration. And every single day, as a perfectionist, I do. There are times where I'm like, that didn't go the way I wanted it to. And but moving on and failing forward.
Ellie Krug, Ellie 2.0 Radio. Only bit of advice I would have is be persistent. Persistence pays off almost all the time. And secondly, just remember that you're human. I mean, we forget about that.
We do forget.
So I like to use the analogy of why as well. A lot of people use why and people hear why, but my why is spelled W-I-Y. And W-I-Y stands for what's inside you. And what I mean by that, and my one piece of advice, is that understand what's inside you and go from there. What I mean is there are those times that we have where we don't have time to strategize, we don't have time to think, we don't have time to plan, and we lead from a place that's just instinctive, right? And it always works out. And so oftentimes when it's time for us to do something, we sort of push that down and we want to be someone else. You know, from a leadership perspective, you know, people read Covey and want to be Covey. Or people read John Maxwell and all of a sudden, I'm going to be John Maxwell. No, the hell you're not. Right? You're just going to be you. And so trust that you're enough and just do it. And guess what? You're going to make mistakes. So what? Right? Just do it. Understand what's inside you and share that with the world, because that's where your greatness lives. It's in the discomfort of really displaying and bringing out what's inside you. And I often try to eat my own dog food, right? You know, and so if I were to sort of sum it up, it'd be grow a pair. Above right?
Either pair, it doesn't matter.
Well, you know, I have a wife, 2 daughters, a female dog, a female oven, a female vacuum cleaner. You know, I live in a world of women, and so, and I tend to think that Okies are a bit stronger than the other ones. So it's what's inside you and lead from there. And it's Kevin D. Wright, and the podcast is the Leadership is Personal Podcast in iTunes, Stitcher, and on leadership-is-personal-podcast.com.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Ken Kunze, Arconnect Sessions. It's how it sounds. Doesn't make sense, but everyone said everything kind of what I wanted to say. And if you don't, here's the other, one thing I'll just say is if you don't know your why, you'll find it. Start it. Just if you have a voice and you're interested in talking to people, don't look for your audience will look for you. But your why will change. And if you can allow it to change, and you don't have to feel guilty about it not changing. We started out wanting to be one thing, and when people start searching us out, we started thinking, oh, maybe this is the topic we should be focusing on. So we really don't have too much of a why. At least I don't really care, because I think you know, it's the profession is broad enough, and we have topics that are open enough that we can kind of talk about what's interesting outside of architecture and still find that we're centered around what we're interested in. So.
Well, that was great advice, everybody. Thank you. I feel like we're all best friends now. All of us. So I think Thanks for indulging us and talking about our adventures, and it's time to break out into small groups. Exactly at 10:15. Nailed it.